Everything you said we already knew, more or less.
Well, here's something that you didn't know. 2 of those special atomic bombs haven't gone off.
Good evening. This is really exciting, and I'm already going off script. But when I was invited to do this keynote, to speak tonight about breaking barriers, I was excited by the concept, and I started to prepare my talk. And then I came yesterday to practice, and I found out that the seniors at Wellington are actually the year 4 students that I taught here before. So if anyone will keep me honest when I'm talking about my teaching, I know it's going to be that group. I'm honored to be here. Now, when I think about breaking barriers, I know that as a reasonably privileged person, I have not had the barriers or the challenges in my life that many other people have had. Some of you may sit on that side. Others of you may sit on the side of having faced extraordinary barriers. And no one can tell just looking at somebody else what barriers they've experienced. But we do know that people who are able to challenge barriers and to affect change share certain characteristics. They're able to identify the barrier in front of them. They're able to imagine the world being a different place or their life being a different life. And ultimately, they're able to work with others to affect change and to achieve a vision. I would argue, and the idea I would posit to all of you tonight, is that the most important tool for breaking barriers is a tool that all of you have. It's having an imagination. Now, overcoming my education probably seems like a strange topic for a person who willingly spends every day in school. I'm 46. I've worked in schools since I was 23, and I'm even back in school myself doing my doctorate right now. But to understand why this topic is important to me, you would need to know 2 things. One thing is the research behind who goes into education and why they do that. The other thing that might also help to know is a secret about me, which won't be a secret once I say it here on camera. I hated school. I mean, really hated going to school, not disliked, loathed. And for me, every day was a struggle. I used any excuse I could not to go to school. When my father had a sabbatical, he was a professor at a local university, I missed 44 or more days of school that year. I became a master of acting. I had a fever, I had a sore throat, something was definitely wrong with me. I read about scarlet fever in Little Women and decided that I had that too and needed a week off from school. But we'll put me aside for a minute and we'll look at the research. So Sally Maitlis is a researcher from the UK who studies people in high-passion careers and burnout. And she identified really 3 key personality types that go into high-passion careers. Education is one of those. There are others, medicine, even working at animal shelters, which was one of her key sites for her study. And she found these 3 personality types. Now, one group of people felt that they had a calling to do the work that they were doing. They were born to do it. Another group of people felt that they had a particular skill or area of knowledge that could be applied. In teaching, that might be the mathematics teacher with a real gift for numbers, or as people say in Boston, good with numbers. It could also be the teacher of English literature with a passion for Victorian poetry who wants to instill that passion in their students. And then the third group were people who felt a social need to do the work that they were doing, weren't sure if they had the skills, and wanted to get upskilled in that field to make a difference. Interestingly, it's that group that wanted to be upskilled that had the lowest levels of burnout in the high-passion population that Sally Maitlis studied. We're not talking about burnout, though. We're talking about barriers. And when I think about teaching, I would add 2 additional categories that might overlap with those 3. One category are people who felt right at home in school. They knew when to sit down, they knew when to stop talking, they knew when to raise their hand. They scored well in spelling tests. They had very, very good penmanship. They were the first to get a pen license in their class. And then you have the rest of us. There might be a few other people in the room who felt like me in school. And another confession, I have been writing in a pen for 46 years. Well, not 46, 41, and I've never gotten a pen license. You see, I was a dreamer, and I lived in Philadelphia, which is a pretty big city in the mid-Atlantic coast of the US. I had an urban woods and farm that backed up to the back of my house. And the place that I wanted to be was not back here in school. It was here in the woods. I knew every trail, I knew every fallen tree, I knew every stump that I could sit on with a book. And when I was in school, I didn't have that sense of being alive that the woods gave me. In fact, I had the sense of being an animal inside of a cage, or, on bad days, being a felon on the wrong side of the law. What do I mean when I say that? Well, as a first grade student, now in the 1970s and 1980s, some of you may have been alive then, getting to school on time was not your parents' responsibility, it was your responsibility. Now, in light of the fact that that responsibility had been ceded to me, the child with the imagination and the wandering soul, I very rarely actually made it to school on time, which landed me in the principal's office periodically. In addition to that, I had a tendency to stare out of the window, and when I should have been paying attention, I made up the stories of the people who were walking by, the lives of adventure and intrigue they were living because they weren't trapped at school. And sometimes that imagination would lend itself to distraction. But as school went on, I kind of learned to play the game, do the thing, get the grades, went to college, and all is good in the world. But it would seem that I would graduate from college, or anybody like me would, and would never, ever want to turn back to education or set foot inside of a school again. And yet here we are. That might have been my story were it not for, I guess that's me floating away from school, were it not for the Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein and a really, really cold night alone in a pension or a youth hostel in Çanakkale in Turkey. Like many other philosophy majors, I thought I'd go to law school, so I was working at a law firm. While I was surrounded by people who had a real passion for what they were doing, I didn't share that passion. And slowly, bit by bit, I felt that chained fence from my school growing up around me, and I knew that I would need to make a change. Now, when I said I was a person with relative privilege, I'm a relative, like not I don't need to worry about paying rent or putting food on the table. So quitting my job and finding myself on a mountaintop was not an option. But I had 2 weeks of vacation, and I decided to take one of those. And in the 1990s, what we did, pre-ubiquitous internet, was we would flick to the back of the travel section in the New York Times and find the cheapest fare we could find to a place we'd never been before. I was doing this alone, and I found an airfare to Turkey. I didn't do much research. It was February, it was cold, slushy, snowy. It was not the optimal time for tourism. In addition to that, there was other research I didn't do. But I did know I wanted to go to Ephesus. And so I bought a bus ticket to go to the coastal city of Çanakkale. Not sure if I'm saying that entirely correctly, but that's how I've said it now for a very long time in telling this story. And some of the research I didn't do in taking this bus trip out to the closest town to Ephesus was whether or not small towns in Turkey in 1996 would have a working ATM. Turned out, Çanakkale didn't. But I don't want you to worry about me, because I had 500,000 Turkish lira. 500,000 Turkish lira, that sounds like so much money. Except that it wasn't really. It was around $5. So I went back to the bus station. I knew I needed to eventually get myself back to Istanbul, got a ticket. My bus would leave the next morning. I went back into Çanakkale that had left me with 300,000 Turkish lira, found a hotel for 100,000 Turkish lira, and then had 200,000 Turkish lira left over for my breakfast and for my dinner, which was going to be a stuffed bread with cheese called a pita and a Coke. But we can go back to that hostel for a minute. That night, as I sat on my threadbare mattress, and I know that that's a cliche, but it's kind of a true cliche in this case because you don't get a lot for $1 a night, in my backpacker's sleeping bag, I started thumbing through my old journal from college, which I brought with me when I traveled. And I started looking at my notes on Ludwig Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein, as a philosopher, had written this book, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And it was a rationalist Anglo-American masterpiece that followed in the tradition of Bertrand Russell. And everyone assumed he would be Russell's protege and go on to continue this tradition of rationalism. But then Wittgenstein did something kind of unusual, and I don't know why he did it. Maybe somebody here does. But he went off to the Austrian countryside and taught kindergarten for 2 years. So I don't know if it was the imagination of the kindergarten students or it was the general level of rationality amongst kindergarten students, but he started to really question what he had posited as ideas around truth and knowledge. And after that time, he returned to academia where he wrote another book called The Philosophical Investigations. And in that book, he challenged and took on everything he wrote before. He was willing to imagine that truth, reality, was something very different than what he had once put out. And there was one aphorism that really stood out in my mind, and I kind of stayed in for a while as I warmed up in my sleeping bag. The limits of my language are the limits of my world. And if Wittgenstein could use language to challenge the way we think about the world, what was it that I wanted to challenge? What was it that I wanted to change? Well, the answer was very clear to me that night. It was education. But that would involve going back into schools, which was something I didn't really want to do. I needed to reimagine what education could be. I needed to go in with a very different purpose, which was to create an education that brought learning and real life together in a school or in a learning environment. To imagine an education that was underpinned by imagination and creativity, and where opportunities for innovation were present in every moment. And along the way, I found many other people, many of whom teach here at this school, who shared that vision and wanted to imagine and to create with me. So tonight, you're going to hear from some extraordinary young people whose words will hopefully spark your ideas and your imagination. And you'll also hear from Ivo, who's not a young person, but he's younger than I am. And when their words spark your imagination, possibly the limits of their language, the language that they put out in front of you, will change or shape the limits of your world. Have a wonderful night.